to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about what it's like to be in space. Our guest is Rusty Schweikart. Mr. Schweikart was an astronaut who walked or floated in space on the Apollo 9 mission. He's the past chairman of the California Energy Commission, and he's interested in where the world is heading. Can you put your experience in space in time for us and describe when you did it and what you did up there?
Yeah, that was about 15 years ago, Charlie, a little over 15 years ago. And it was the third flight in the Apollo series of missions. This was actually 2 flights before the first lunar landing, and it was the first time that we'd flown the lunar module, so we took it up into Earth orbit for 10 days. And during those 10 days, we checked out the lunar module, which is the main purpose for the mission, but also I had the backpack on my back that would be used later on the moon, and went outside for a spacewalk on the 4th day of the mission.
Were you attached to the spaceship by some kind of a tether line then?
Exactly, attached by a tether, but not an umbilical. The distinction, of course, being that an umbilical provides one life support, whereas in my case, all of that came from the backpack itself, and the only thing I had connecting me to the spacecraft was a string or a tether.
Was it scary?
No, not at all. It's very exciting and very beautiful, but it's not the least bit scary. Weightlessness is a very secure feeling. It's not at all the sensation of falling that technically it is in fact. That is, you really are falling, but people often think about that in terms of the sort of dropping out of the floor of an elevator when they start down in an elevator or something of that kind, or flying an airplane and suddenly you rise off the seat. It's the steady state version of that. What you're feeling in the elevator and what you feel in an airplane is the transition from 1G to something less than 1G and then back to 1G again. In weightlessness, you're actually at 0G on a steady state basis, and it's very comfortable.
Is there a freedom associated with that feeling?
Oh yeah. There's a great deal of freedom. It's amazing how in all of the space experience, and especially in the early days when we were dealing with very small vehicles like the Mercury and Gemini and then the Apollo was really the first time we had a chance to move around inside the spacecraft. The Gemini and Mercury were too small, actually, to ever get out of the seat. But in Apollo, you had 3 people, 3 spacesuits, an incredible amount of equipment, in something about the size of a Volkswagen. And yet, no one ever complained at all about feeling claustrophobic. And the reason I'm convinced is because in weightlessness, with the ability just to float around, it seems to open up the space, and it's really quite a comfortable sensation. And of course, in Skylab, when we could really move around, then people began tumbling and doing all those wonderful things that you can do in the absence of gravity. So it's a very enjoyable sensation, frankly, and one that tends to catch your attention.
One of the things that we try to get at oftentimes on Infinity is the true meaning of nature, what is natural and what is unnatural. Was there a feeling in your mind, or is there a feeling now, that the weightlessness, the state of weightlessness, is a natural state as opposed to walking around and having heavy arms and legs all day long?
People will never believe this, but I'm about to answer you with a poem, if I can remember it. This is a poem that was written by Joe Kerwin, who flew on the first Skylab mission. And Skylab, of course, was our first space station, in a sense, and it had about the internal volume of a 2-bedroom house. It was really quite large, and so you could really move around for the first time in space. And Joe was a medical doctor, flew with Pete Conrad and Paul Weitz, on that first Skylab mission, and he and his wife Lee had a sort of a tradition in the family where on their birthdays they would write the other one a poem as a gift for their birthdays. And Lee's birthday came up while Joe was up in orbit. And so after 3 weeks in flight, he wrote this poem, and it's a perfect answer to your question, if I don't muff it. He said, "We're getting used to knowing how to fly. When I was young, I used to fly and dream up ways so high and easy it would seem as if earth wheeled and slanted and not I. And now it's real. We move that way at will, like dust motes in a sunbeam. Push away, drift down your own trajectory, tumble, play, and who can tell which moves and which is still? In this high sunlit ship, the laws of space, mass without weight, height without vertigo, train our nerve ways to their easy pace as if this rhythm were our native state. What if man were an exile from the sky, and we perhaps remembering how to fly?" Hey, I like that. I got all the way through it.
It's a beautiful poem.
It is. It's an incredible poem, and what it does is it captures both the freedom that one feels in weightlessness and also the mysterious, rapid adaptation that you have to it. You don't tend to flap around and bash into things in an extremely amazing way, really. You move around, and almost from the beginning, even though in terms of your inner ear, in fact, you may feel uncomfortable, you may feel nauseous, in terms of physically moving around and moving about, going places and things, it's incredible how rapidly you adapt to it. And so Joe's poem just picks up that little wonderment of the origins of mankind.
I was probing at something else, and I think the direct question is did your experience in space bring you closer to God?
Well, I guess that depends an awful lot on your on how big your God is, or how broad your God is. I would tend to say yes, but certainly not in the sense of, let me say, a traditional understanding of God, but in terms of an understanding of what life is about and the relationship and interaction between life and the universe. The whole evolutionary process of life. I would say that my space experience brought me into direct contact with those questions. It isn't as if there were any answers or any great revelation, but when one looks at the Earth from space and realizes that in some sense the Earth is the local womb for consciousness, self-awareness, the evolutionary process of life, one cannot help but put that in the larger perspective of what, other than the Earth, appears to be a fairly lifeless environment. So the kinds of traditional big questions that people ask of, what's it all about? Why am I here? How can I get out of taxes? Those big deals. Space is something which causes you to really look into that mirror.
Oftentimes when we're on the planet and we look up toward the stars, the space beyond the sky at night particularly looks dark and deep and cold, and there is a feeling often associated with it, and that is loneliness. It looks lonely in space. Did that perspective shift as you moved into space looking back at the Earth? Did it look like a warm, homey, cozy kind of place with a fire in the fireplace?
Yeah, it really did. There really is not any other lifelike object to rest your eyes on other than the Earth when you're in space. And if on a clear desert night it looks pretty black out there, in space it's even blacker. Of course, the sun, if you're far enough away, you're in sunlight most of the time, but the background is completely black always. The blue sky is entirely below you. And so the contrast between this planet, this blue and white planet teeming with life, and the rest of the universe is very pronounced. And it does appear, the Earth itself is something which you feel very close to when you're away from it. It's, I think the best expression of that I can recall was one night during Apollo 8, which was the Christmas Eve flight in 1968 that went out around the moon. They were on their way back from orbiting around the moon, and late one evening, Houston time, Mike Collins was on Capcom. He was the astronaut communicating with the guys in the spacecraft, and Bill Anders was the only one awake. We were taking shifts sleeping at that particular time, and the other two guys were asleep, and Bill was up sort of on watch in the spacecraft on the way back to the Earth after having been one of the first three people to orbit the moon. And he and Mike Collins were sort of ruminating in the middle of the night about this experience, and Mike asked him what it felt like looking out the window and realizing he was coming back to Earth. And Bill started to describe how he felt and called on the metaphor of the early explorers sailing around the Earth and coming back around the southern tip of Africa, heading back up to Portugal or Spain or somewhere. And how he said he now knows how they must have felt in terms of coming home and that sensation of coming back to what really means so much to them. And as he described that, he choked up. And that's when you know Bill, he's not the kind of person who would choke up. And so the sort of power of the experience that he clearly didn't recognize until that moment that was inside of him came through in a way which really touched everyone that knew them.
I have one question, and then I'd like to bring the discussion back to the planet and look at the experience from this perspective. But when you were in space, and when your colleagues were experiencing their space walks and their freedom in space in the space capsules, did you feel a presence other than the human presence that you have? Was there something else there with you that you are aware of consciously?
Well, I guess the answer to it is yes, but it would be pretty difficult to put a word on. The thing which illustrated that to me during my own flight was brought about through an interesting circumstance where the very first small portable voice tape recorders were coming out then, the Sonys, and it's hard to remember that they haven't always been around, but that was 15 and a half years ago. And so we carried a voice recorder, a portable voice recorder, so that we could, in essence, take notes without having to write things down and handle paper and that sort of thing. But the batteries would actually last for more than one cassette, but they wouldn't quite last for two. And so the rule was that after we used a set of batteries for one cassette of notes, then we could set those batteries aside and we could play music. And so we were the first people that flew that took music up with us. And I took a couple of classical pieces that I had been playing Sunday evenings, which was my habit every Sunday evening at home, to sort of fill a small circle of light around me with books and various quotations, which I took up with me in space, and it was sort of a routine every Sunday evening. And so I took that music up in flight with me, and my compatriots, Jim McDivitt and Dave Scott, didn't particularly care for my music, and so mysteriously I was unable to find my tape until the 9th day of the mission, when suddenly Dave Scott came up out of the lower equipment bay and said, "Is this the tape you've been looking for, Rusty?" And so I thanked him very much. And for lunch that day, I took off my headset and figured I'd leave the communication to the two of them, and I'd listen to my music here on the 9th day of the 10-day mission. So I put the tape recorder on the wall next to me and got out my lunch and got everything all set and turned on the tape recorder to listen to music while I ate my lunch, and sort of glanced out the window as the music started, and it was that casual. And then that music came out, and it was as if it grabbed me by the soul and pulled me down into my home, into my house with my family, the kids. That environment, it was sort of this incredible connection with life on the surface of the earth, and it just it was one of the most powerful emotional experiences I've ever had, and it caused me to realize that incredible linkage with the rest of life when you're out there in space. So that's a sort of roundabout way of describing the kind of unity of all life which you feel very connected with when you're in that environment.
Let's talk now about your interests. You talked about music and some quotations that were familiar to you. What changed when you came back to the planet, and how has your life been directed since that time of landing on terra firma?
Well, I think the experience that we've been talking about is obviously a very powerful one. I suppose the best way to summarize it would be that I really came to face, in a sense, by leaving the planet, the unity of life on the planet. The fact that while we have many, many differences and silly things, boundaries and borders, which we fight over and kill one another over even, that what really is the unity of life, the interrelatedness of all life on the planet. That's what's really evident when you get away from it, when you step back and look at it from that perspective. And I think with the kinds of the power of the technologies that we have today, we are at a point where the understanding of our interrelatedness is something which has to come across in order for us to assure any future for our, not just for our children and grandchildren, but for hopefully thousands of generations of people yet to come. And I think that it is not, if you will, accidental then that the same technology which can put a bomb within 100 feet of the Kremlin wall is also the technology which allows us to look back and understand ourselves in a new perspective. And so what I've done in my own way then, since my experience in space, has been to take that recognition, that understanding, and try to bring that to people. That yes, we have differences, but the overriding thing is that we are all members of the same family, that we are all related, and that we must learn, we must put a lot of our energies into learning to live with one another and not do one another in. Survival lies in all of us surviving, not some of us.
Is that pretty common among those individuals who had the opportunity to travel in space, to have taken that perspective? Or do you have people who have come back from space that are more militaristic than ever?
Well, I frankly don't know of anyone, Charlie, who's come back, let me say, more militaristic than when they've gone into space. But I certainly am aware of people for whom the experience did not have the same kind of profound implication that and effect that it did on me. But to the extent that people have been affected by the experience, it seems to me, at least from the people I know, that it has had a version of this same impact.
It's been 15 and a half years. Has the world improved any in that time?
It's not easy to say what the measure of improvement of the world would be. Certainly one can find positive indicators, and one can probably find negative indicators. My own feeling is that there is a real race going on. There is an open question of whether we will make it through what I see as a kind of narrow point or a necking down of the evolution of life here on the earth before opening up, or whether it will pinch down to zero. That is, whether we will self-extinguish or whether we will become citizens of the universe, as it were, cosmic citizens, is an issue which will be answered, I believe, in our lifetimes. That is, we are really at that moment in history where we, for the first time, have the power to wipe out the development of life here on the planet. And alternatively, and ironically, using the same technologies, but to a different end, we have the opportunity to open up the future for the continued development by, in essence, graduating into the cosmos. It's an incredible thing that we're alive in this time. I mean, it's just an amazing opportunity. I don't know where it's going to come out. I mean, I really think it's a tight race. Which way? Whether we will use and control the technologies which we have developed, or whether we will allow our baser nature, or the fears and anxieties and mistrust, to dominate our use of the technology.
Do you feel a personal responsibility because of your experience? Do you think, in a sort of fatalistic sense, that you are one of the very few that were chosen through, I'm sure when you were growing up, you had no idea that you would be doing what you were doing, or that you'd be here today and doing what you're doing. So a lot of things unfolded before you. You were in that position. You had these feelings in space, the connectedness feeling, the oneness of all of life. Is that a sacred trust that you must act on?
Well, I don't have any sense of having been chosen. In a way, somebody has to have flown. I mean, as someone once said, every astronaut's got to be somewhere, right? So I happen to be in this body. But from my own perspective, it was really just incredible luck that I happened to be one of these people who has actually had that opportunity. But we've all done it. It's not something which is an experience only held by the people who sort of physically had that opportunity. I think it's an experience which has now affected all of us. I mean, it's the magic of communication between human beings, the ability to, at least to some extent, to share experience and to learn from what other people have experienced. But to answer your question more directly, yes, having been one of the people who had that incredible opportunity, I felt and still feel a very real obligation to make that real, to really share that experience at a level not of the gee whiz, but of the deeper meanings of it, deeper implications of it, with other people.
Is it difficult
too?
Is it difficult to keep that perspective, that kind of cosmic overview perspective, when you're down here caught up in a traffic jam, let's say, or some other mundane situation?
Oh, sure. It's. I mean, life is life. I mean, I've got pimples on my butt and itches under the arm and all kinds of things. I mean, it's just, people are people. The wonderful thing about people is their ability to have the higher human experiences and talents and thoughts shine through all of those very real things that make us so human.
Do you feel an affinity with people who haven't left the planet but who get a broader perspective through some other means, meditation, for example, or some other spiritual or physical discipline?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I think there's a very real and tight relationship between the whole inner exploration and the outer exploration. I really see the two not just being related, but in fact being dependent upon one another. The exploration of the inner world is one in which people are learning about themselves and understanding what life and what humanity is all about. And I think that those broader questions and the broader understanding one gets in grappling with those questions is necessary in terms of putting perspective on the outer exploration. And I think that the two are quite tightly related. Inner exploration without the consensus reality process is something which can get extremely distorted to the point where there comes to be no reality. So I think that the two maintaining communication is very important.
Is it easier for people to have an understanding of all that we've talked about today than it was before the space exploration began? In other words, when people looked at the stars and looked at the moon before we had physically visited those places, there were, I imagine, people on the planet who had a fairly good idea of what it was all about and had grasped that sense through the inner exploration. Is it easier because of the experience that you've lived for us to understand that today?
I'm not really sure. I'd like to say yes, but I'm not sure that there is a clear answer to that yet. I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier. It is the understanding of our place in the universe, which I think is somehow pivotal in the question of where we are headed and how we're going to come through this this challenge / opportunity which we're looking at. I believe it's always important to have a large perspective and apply that to where one puts one's foot next. I mean, as the Buddhists say, what's really important is where you put your foot next. But it's done with a perspective in which, also in the Buddhist tradition, my responsibility is infinite.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.